This unit is disgustingly broken. These boys are the dirtiest unit in Shogun 2. I feel like I have to shower after just looking at them. Hey, I am Triple Z Hacker, and do you love building armies? Well, in this video, I will be covering army compositions for Total War Shogun 2's multiplayer Avatar Conquest. It's a rather complicated topic, and there's plenty of options when it comes to crafting your army. But feel free to comment below any suggestions or what army compositions you like to use. Even for those who prefer single player, comment below the armies you use on the campaign. Now for this guide, I will be focusing on land battles only. That's right, no sieges, but in the future, perhaps I'll make a video on siege battles. Now in Shogun 2 multiplayer for your army composition, the most important aspect is its value. That's right, the amount of money, funds you spend. You want to maximize this and optimize this value and have a cost-efficient army. But you know who is more valuable than all these funds, all this koku, all this money? You. That's right, you. I love you. And if you love Shogun 2, you'll love my channel, so be sure to like and subscribe for more content. With that, let's begin the guide. I've split this video into multiple chapters, so feel free to skip around as you wish. Now, before I go over any specifics on army composition, there are several main principles I'm going to go over. The first is that there's no perfect army. Any army has its strengths and weaknesses, and no army is invincible in this game. The next is that the army composition you choose largely depends on your playstyle. If you don't have a playstyle yet, don't worry, as you play this game, you will develop one over time. To go along with playstyle, create an army that you enjoy using. Don't just use an army because you think it's the best. Remember, this is a game and you want to have fun and enjoy it. Understand all the different unit types and how each of them functions on the battlefield. Know also which units counter each other. For instance, spears counter cav, swords counter spears. Know the different battle maps and how they affect your army. You don't want to bring a bunch of cav to a map full of rivers, like Osaka Plain. Retainer selection significantly impacts your army composition, so be mindful of what retainers work well with your armies. Your avatar level determines the cost, so the higher the level of your avatar, the more expensive they are. Now, lower level avatars, of course, are able to recruit more units, or at least bring more units into the multiplayer battle. However, higher level avatars have more retainers and more skills on the avatar skill tree. Speaking of skills, the skills you allocate to your general play a vital role in the composition of your armies. A bow general, for instance, might bring a skirmish-based army, whereas a melee general might bring a rush-based army. This isn't always the case, but it's just important to keep in mind. Unit micromanagement is a huge aspect of Shogun 2, and in order to develop that skill, it takes time. With practice, and of course, just losing a bunch, you'll eventually gain micro skills. And the more you just play Total War, the better your micro becomes. If you keep losing because of micro, don't worry, it's okay. It just happens to everyone.
It is what it is.
The last main concept to understand is the different levels of warfare and how they can be applied to Shogun 2. The actual battles, the engagement between you and your enemy, fall under the tactical level of warfare, but determining your army composition falls under the strategic level, as the allocation of units is a strategic decision. So you want to develop a strategy that gives you certain tactical advantages in your battle. Keep this in mind as I present the different types of army compositions throughout the video. The last thing I want to mention before we get into the army composition specifics is that for Avatar Conquest match-made battles, there are 3 separate types of levels of funds that you have for your army compositions. It is small, medium, or large. There is no ultra for the match-made battles. Basically, at the small level, you want to have cheap units and be very selective about which units you choose. For medium, you want to have a mixture of some quality units with some cheap units. For large, you have tons of money, tons of options, so choose whichever units you feel like is going to give you the best chance of winning. Anyways, with all those things out of the way, let us now go into the major types of army compositions, and then we'll talk about the current meta. There are 3 main categories of Shogun 2 armies: rush armies, balanced armies, and skirmish armies. These categories are determined based on the objectives each different type of army is intended to accomplish. Sometimes these categories can be blurred and certain armies can fall under both, so it's not always so clear-cut. Within each of these categories as well exist certain subcategories for more specific armies and hybrid armies as well. There's tons of different combinations for army compositions, so it's really hard to just narrow them down and simplify them, but I think these 3 major categories is the best way to explain it. Rush armies. These armies, as their name indicates, rush into combat quickly in an aggressive fashion in order to overwhelm and swiftly defeat their opponents. The first example of a rush army is what you see before you, the dreaded cav spam. This army composition is very mobile and can be devastating against unprepared players. Typically, cav spammers take the advantage of pulling through units to weaken morale. This is usually banned in competitive tournaments, but in match made it frequently happens. Other rush examples include Nodachi spam, sword spam, Naginata warrior monk spam, and the infamous older lone sword spam that thankfully no longer exists, as you can only bring a max of 4 lone swords now. Also, other combinations of rush armies include things such as a combination of, let's say, a ton of cav here with a mixture of some monks even. So this is another example of a possibility of a monk spam right here. Additionally, you have, if you get rid of the monks, you can get cav with some nodachis, maybe even throw in some katanas, some lone swords. So again, just these types of army compositions also fall under rush style. And this is, of course, a subsection of rush armies. This would be a hybrid rush army, so like a cav core, sword core, rush army composition. Now, another famous example, or at least an army composition that I've run into quite a bit sometimes, is the it's kind of funny because the idea behind it is really interesting, but you get pretty much the Nodachi Yari Samurai spam. And essentially what this army does is that all these Nodachis charge in, and then the Yari Samurai protect their flanks as they engage in melee, so the Nodachis are protected from cav. Again, a very interesting army composition, and also considered a rush army, because again, the goal is that they're trying to win the battle as quickly as possible. That is the case for all rush armies. Also, the use of, say, Naginata Samurai, or maybe even Naginata Attendants here as cheap cannon fodder, also make their appearances in rush armies. Now, another funny army composition for the rush armies here is one that I tend to think is used somewhat, and whenever it's pulled off, it's really funny and quite brilliant, actually. So you get a bunch of cav here, and then of course you use Kisho ninjas. Now the idea behind this army composition is that, let's say you throw in some more cav here, for instance, you get some light cav in there as well. So again, for an army composition like this, you have all this cav rush up, you know, try to overwhelm your opponent, scare your opponent initially, and then you spring the trap with all these Kisho ninjas here, throw all their blinding grenades, bombs, whatnot, however you upgrade them as veterans and everything. It's quite an interesting army composition, and also is considered a rush army. The last thing to mention about rush armies is that these armies typically have a leadership or melee general. Balanced armies. As the name suggests, these armies employ a collection of all or most unit types, not necessarily an equal number of each. These armies are very adaptive and flexible. The focus on balance is because of the concept of combined arms, which seeks to integrate different combat arms of a military to achieve mutually complementary effects. Now, this concept is generally thought to have been applied to 20th and 21st century warfare. However, historians have used it in the past when talking about famous battles. One example of the use of combined arms being successful in a battle was the Battle of Hastings with the Norman invasion of England in 1066. The Normans used cav, bows, and their melee infantry to, of course, defeat the Saxons. So the concept of combined arms can also be applied to Shogun too, and that is where the balanced armies come in, because you use all the different unit types that you have at your disposal in order to achieve victory. It's important to note, though, that balanced armies tend to sometimes blur the lines between the other two categories, rush and skirmish type armies, so keep that in mind. Now, an example of a balanced army would be this army right here that I tend to use. It's a mixture of types of infantry. You have some Naginatas, and you have some swords. You also have anti-cav troops here. I mean, you can replace these with Yaris if you wish. You have, of course, your bow, and you have the cav. Now, of course, you can add a gun unit. There's a ton of things you can do with this sort of template. You can also replace the katanas with monks. You can replace the Naginatas with a Yari or two. You can place the katanas with Nodachis. So again, I like to be really flexible, but again, they don't necessarily have to all be veteran units either. Another well-known example of a balanced army is an all Ashigaru based army with some elite cav and maybe an elite bow unit or two. So here is the example for that, and you can see that veteran Ashigaru are cheaper and can be more cost effective in multiplayer, which is something really crucial when it comes to your army compositions. You want to find units that are cost effective, that are efficient, that get the job done in battles. Other examples of balanced armies would be core armies introduced by Fish Sandwich Patrol years ago on YouTube. Before you is the Katana Corps. You can also have things like the Naginata Corps and even a Cav Corps, for instance. So all these different types of army compositions have a specific unit in mind that is the focus, but there are also vital supporting units here that help achieve victory and are critical to the success of your army composition. Balanced armies don't rely on one unit type to bring them victory. Sometimes the cav will do well. Other times it could be the spears or the bows or the guns or the swords. And sometimes all of the units can do well and work in unison to achieve victory. Now, for balanced armies, there are dozens of hybrids and variations that you can do with your army compositions. It's just important to keep in mind that a flexible and an army that can adapt to any situation is very advantageous in multiplayer, and just being able to use all the different types of units will help you become a better Shogun 2 player. For beginners, I recommend bringing a balanced army and a leadership general. Skirmish armies. These armies skirmish. It's in the name, and they focus on slowly depleting their opponent's forces. Skirmish armies occasionally rely on terrain advantages and remain patient on the battlefield. They also focus on outpositioning their opponents and taking control over the map with their ranged capabilities. An example for this army would be the Bow Corps, again also coined by Fish Sandwich Patrol, but here you have an elite bow force. That's the main focus, where a lot of your funding is going into for your army. Then you have a bunch of supporting units protecting and defending those bows. Other examples of army compositions such as this perhaps include some variations, like you throw in maybe some matchlocks here as well, and so you have a mixture of matchlocks and bows. So again, still a skirmish based army. The thing is that matchlocks by themselves, so let's get a few matchlocks, and if you bring an army like this, the problem is that these matchlocks are relatively undefended from ranged attacks, so enemy bows will be able to shoot at them. So you have to bring some bows in order to support them, and that way these bows keep the enemy bows at bay, or away from these matchlock units. One of the things to keep in mind though with skirmish armies is that they are very susceptible to rush armies. So the more missile units that you bring, the more that you are likely to get obliterated by rush armies, so tread carefully. Another skirmish army example here would be using this lovely unit right, where are they? No, they're here somewhere. Ah, yes, fire rockets. So a fire rocket army. And basically you would just insert the fire rockets into maybe one of those templates. You would get some bows and probably have a lot of spears and a lot of defense for those fire rockets. The fire rockets in land battle are very valuable actually as anti-cav, and the only problem is that those fire rockets can be expensive, and you want to ensure that they have an impact on the battlefield so that way your money is not wasted. So you need to ensure that they get tons of kills, so you have to protect them. Also, fire rockets are great for general sniping. Other siege units can also be used, but I tend to not really see them as viable in multiplayer. Other than the Kisho Ninjas, the firebomb throwers potentially, but the European cannons and mangonels are really just for memes or for sieges. But again, they're still fun to use. But in terms of army compositions, yeah, the fire rocket army is definitely a viable and fun army to use as a skirmish army. Of course, skirmish armies typically use a bow general, but a leadership general works too. All right, now is the moment most of you have been waiting for. I'm going to discuss the meta around the army compositions that are used in Total War Shogun 2 multiplayer. I'll show you a few army compositions that pretty much sum up the meta of the multiplayer scene currently, and I'll talk about why they're successful and how they're used. The first I have for you is right here. It is an effective army composition, and one I kind of modeled my own army composition off of. I've seen a few players use this sort of template for an army composition. Again, this is just a variation. You can switch out some of these units. I've seen people, for instance, have 2 Great Guards here, Sometimes they don't even have the bow warrior monks and they get more Nodachis or more Naginata warrior monks, maybe even a katana samurai, even and turn it into a rush army. So again, there's a few options with that army composition. It's generally a balanced or rush army composition. Main point about it is that it's a group of just elite veteran units, all ranging from rank 2 to 6, maybe even some rank 9, although those can get kind of expensive. But again, it's a very elite quality amount of troops being used. So whole idea behind this army composition is that it is quality over quantity in multiplayer, and that these units will just be superior regardless if they're outnumbered or not. Now, the next set of army compositions I have for you is from a tournament, actually. It's from a tournament 6 years ago. It was a grand finals match between Stellar Fire and the Prussian Prince. So for this tournament, both of them were using their avatars. We'll start with the Prussian Prince. I did not get his exact army composition from the videos I watched on YouTube, but I'll link the videos in the descriptions for you guys to watch those matches. And the commentary is pretty good. For the Prussian Prince, he did use tons of cav. He had some fire cav. He also had 3 Yari cav units. Again, I don't really remember the ranks, so don't really worry too much about the ranks. Just worry about the units themselves. Additionally, he had also 3 light cav as well. So again, tons of cav from the Prussian Prince. He had some Naginata attendants. I don't remember how many. He also had, I think it was some Lone Sword Ashigaru. I believe they're also like rank 9 as well. He also had some of the long Yari Ashigaru here as well. The rest of the units, I think, were maybe some elite samurai and other things, but part of the army composition for the Prussian Prince. Again, you can see why this army would be good, because you have a ton of elite cav units. You have some scouts here with the light cav. You got cheap fodder units for the attendants. These lone swords are probably all rank 9, so again, they're pretty elite melee troops. I know, lone swords being elite melee troops. It's shocking, but it does happen in multiplayer. Now, for the army composition of Stellar Fire, I was able to get the exact army composition that he brought for one of the matches, and it's a really interesting army composition to look at. He brought 2 units of bow cav, which bow cav aren't really used too much in the meta, so kind of ignore this bow cav here. Typically, they just run with a bow general or maybe even a better bow unit currently, but he also brought some fire cav, so again, fire cav, super good, a cheaper version of Great Guard, so to speak. He also brought some Matchlock Warrior Monks, which again are a very good unit. They're susceptible to missile fire, but overall they have really good range and accuracy and reload for Matchlock, so definitely see why they brought them. Also, you have 2 Matchlock Samurai as well. He also brought some light cav, about 2 units of light cav. Additionally, he brought a ton of Naginata attendants, 4 of them, in fact. Additionally, he had 1 sword attendant. I think he just had leftover money. And then he had 3 really elite rank 9 katana samurai. So just imagine that these guys are, I mean, I don't know if they're all actually rank 9. Yeah, they're all rank 6, but imagine they were rank 9. Again, it's a really interesting army composition. This is pretty much a skirmish army because all the matchlocks and the bow cav, but it also has some nice balance to it. The main takeaway from these 2 armies and the lessons is that you have certain units in your army that are very elite, super high level troops that are going to, of course, carry the day for you. And then you have these nice, supporting, cheap, cost-effective units that perform multiple small roles in the battlefield that are usually overlooked but have huge impacts on the battle. So this is also something you want to take in mind and a lesson you want to keep. This last army composition for the video is the one I faced the most against the high-level players who still play multiplayer. I consider it both a skirmish and balanced army. It is in essence an army of early modern pike and shot warfare modeled on the Spanish tercios. So as you can see, this is the army composition. Now, the one reason this army composition is so successful and it's heavily involved with the meta is this unit. This unit is disgustingly broken, and they pretty much invalidate almost all the other units on this roster. I mean, they're absolutely insane. If a player is able to use this army and micro it well and efficiently, then this unit is absolutely deadly, and there's really not a lot you can do about it. There are some counters, which I'll get into in a second, but overall, this unit makes this army really, really potent. Now, of course, this is just one of the many variations that this gun army, as some of my Discord members have called it, takes on. As you can see, you have an elite bow unit that, of course, has a lot of range, so it protects these 3 matchlock Ashigaru here, and typically most of these matchlock Ashigaru have really nice upgrades. You can see like rapid volley, for instance, with this one. Sometimes you can replace these matchlock Ashigaru though with like 2 matchlock samurai as well, or maybe even a matchlock warrior monk. These Yari Ashigaru here don't really have to be this high of a rank, but if you're a spear clan, you typically go for a hold firm with them. In my case, you don't really need them to be this expensive, and sometimes you can have like a long Yari Ashigaru if you want to. These lone swords, most of them have like bonsai or just rank 9 and really good, but typically you want to have them have bonsai as they have unbreakable morale. Again, it's also really cost efficient with all this Ashigaru. They're super cheap. Matchlocks are deadly, just like one of the best units in Shogun 2 multiplayer, and they can kill anything in 2 volleys. So they're anti-cav, they're almost anti-infantry, really, really good. Of course, you have some elite cav units as well. You have very fast cav with the light cav. So these elite cav units protect the mounted gunners. They also, of course, defend all these other units. And you have the bulletproof samurai, which you can switch out for Yari samurai or other units. Maybe, for instance, grab some more attendants as well with this army composition. I've occasionally seen people use bow cav or maybe even the bow hero with this army composition as well. Typically, it's run with a bow general, and the bow general has 200 range, insane reload, accuracy, armor-piercing arrows. So, again, there's a lot of variations with this army composition, and it is really, really good when you know how to use it. So, let's just talk about some of the tactics and things with this meta army. And eventually, I'll make a video showcasing this army in a battle, but I'll just talk through some of the things it does right now. So, the first thing is that your front line are these matchlocks. They're defended right behind with these spears, and then behind the spears are the swords. Now, you assign 1 spear, 1 matchlock, and 1 sword to a group, and they work pretty much in square formations. Basically 3 rows, and they work in a way like a tercio. Because, the Spanish tercios had pikes, they had guns, and they had swords. So, again, it was a composition of all 3, and this is where combined arms takes effect, because you have guns, spears, and swords all working together in said fashion. And so, again, it is pike and shot warfare at its finest. And of course, even in pike and shot warfare, cav was essential, so that's why you have some elite cav, and then you have the gun cav, and the gun cav controls so much space. As long as you keep them alive, you're able to do tons of damage, rack up hundreds of kills with this army. The other tactics is that you have these Daikyu samurai. They have really good armor for a bow unit, not the greatest. I think bow samurai have the same amount, but again, they have the nice range, and they have good accuracy. They'll win against bow warrior monks in most, one-on-one fights. And they're able to protect the matchlocks long enough and keep, your opponent at bay and keep the skirmish going. Essentially, that's most of the tactics around this army. There's a lot of more minute tactics where, like, you get attendants and you send the attendants forward and kind of draw their forces, out into the open. Then you bring your mounted gunners in and blast them to pieces. There's other things like that where you typically, send your cav in purposely for the cav fight and then send your mounted gunners over and shoot, your enemy's cav in the flank. Again, there's tons of little minute tactics with bringing an army such as this, and I will make a video eventually showcasing this meta army. So now that we've gone over the tactics and everything, let's talk about the ways to counter an army such as this. The first thing is that trying to eliminate this gun cav, and mounted gunners or Donderbus, either or, sometimes both even. How do you eliminate the gun cav? Well, there's a few options. You can try to shoot them with bows. Let's say, bring a bow general is a really good way. Bringing maybe even a bow hero, for instance. But again, if they micro well enough, they can avoid your arrows. Sometimes you can just send cav after them, but that can also cost, you cav units that are very expensive. You can send light cav with maybe speed upgrades and the, retainer upgrades to increase the speed for your cav. You can also hit your opponent with the Livestock Pestilence Retainer, which slows down cav, which is pretty good to catch these mounted gunners when they're trying to flee away after they, fired a volley. Additionally, you can use matchlocks to fight the mounted gunners, because the matchlocks have about the same range, unless, of course, they get the upgraded range. But even then, these matchlocks still can maybe get a volley on the mounted gunners if they don't fire quickly enough. And matchlocks are really good, actually, to counter these Donderbus cav here, which, as you can see, have less range than the matchlocks themselves. Another way, of course, is to bring mounted gunners as well and have a mounted gunner versus mounted gunner fight. Typically, those battles last quite a long time and involve tons of positioning, so it's possible, but again, you run the risk of course, losing your mounted gunners, and then you're without mounted gunners, and that's going to be a tough battle to win. Another option to deal with this army, of course, is just flat out rushing it, getting a rush army set up and just rushing this army before this army is able to set up. I found a lot of good success in, of course, screening with cheaper units, so for instance, sending Naginata attendants forward to take the initial volleys from these matchlocks, and as they're reloading, charging in with the more elite units to, of course, attack the front line. And if you're able to destroy this army's front line, then you're likely going to win the battle. So that's another way to counter this meta army. There are two more options. You could go for these bows right here, their elite bow unit, whether they be Daikyu, Samurai, Bow Warrior, Monks, for instance. And once you take out this elite bow unit, you're able to then have your own missile units target these matchlocks right here, rendering this army a lot weaker than it could be. Additionally, you could also go for the cav here. With this meta army, it relies a lot on this heavy cav, or the shock cav, the elite cav force, because this elite cav force protects a lot of things. It runs with the mounted gunners, for instance. It also prevents you from flanking around with this army. You want to try to take out certain aspects of this army, and if you're able to do that, then you can perhaps overcome this meta army composition. The last thing I want to mention about this meta army composition real quickly is that, again, this is one variation, and there's a ton of different options you have with this army. It's really hard to use and very micro intensive, but if you're able to micro it effectively, then you might win a ton of battles, but you might also lose some. I mean, again, sometimes you run into the exact same army composition, and that's when it becomes an issue, and it really turns into almost like Empire Total War, so to speak, which can be really interesting. Again, though, this is the meta army, but there's no clear-cut army that wins consistently, so just keep that in mind. A lot of people love using this army currently in Shogun 2 multiplayer. I hope you all found this army composition guide video informative and that it will help you in your multiplayer and even campaign battles. If I missed anything, let me know in the comments, and also comment below which guide you would like to see next. As always, like and subscribe for more Shogun 2, and take care.